I would call that closed loop.
Closed loop, okay. And whereas, Visa and MasterCard are not.
Yeah, so, I just learned that distinction because somebody told me that Amex has a debit card. And Amex came out and said in the context of surcharging, and Amex does indeed have a debit card. I just found this out.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
It's only around since like 2023. It's a brand new thing. But when we were talking to some people on the surcharging side in a particular industry, they were saying that at Amex, all surcharges had to be uniform, even for debit cards. And I was like, you can't surcharge debit cards. What are you talking about? That's like a direct violation of Durbin. Amex is closed loop. Durbin doesn't apply to it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I had never made that distinction, and I don't know, can't remember who it was that told me this, but I was really kind of blown away. Like, first that Amex had debit cards. Like,
right, that kind of blew, I'm writing that one down.
Yeah, totally. I was like, can somebody verify that? Because I've never heard of that at all.
Welcome to the Payments Experts Podcast, a podcast of Global Legal Law Firm. We hope you enjoy this episode. Very excited. We've got a remote podcast today. In studio joining us, founding and managing partner of the law firm, Christopher Dryden, as well as our special guest, we have Patti Murphy, who is the self-proclaimed payments maven of the Fourth Estate. Patti, we love having you on the podcast. This is the first time we've done one with you and Chris, so we're really looking forward to it.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm really excited about it. I know I did one with you early on, I think, but this is definitely the first I've done it with Chris, and it's the first you've called me Payments Maven, the Fourth Estate. That is definitely a self-proclaimed title, but as I like to say to people, I understand this business better than anybody else who can write well.
Well, I will tell you, you've been in it for a long time, so you know what's going on. It's always a pleasure to have you on because you're a wealth of knowledge. But for our listeners, I
appreciate that.
It's well deserved. So tell our listeners, why are you the payments maven of the Fourth Estate?
Well, I started writing about payments in the 1970s. It was like 77 maybe or thereabouts. My very first job out of college, I was editing a handbook. I was working for a bank regulatory agency, and I was editing a handbook for EFT examinations.
That is great.
It was so new at the time. They didn't even call ATMs.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? I mean, like, you've seen it from day one, almost.
Yeah. And I did a lot of work after I left the government. I went into working covering the government, covering the regulatory agencies, covering Congress, the Fed, Congress, all the consumer protection laws, the EFT Act as it was implemented into regulations. I saw, the first ATM go into existence and the first networks come into existence. And, I remember interviewing a guy back in the late 70s, and he said, this stuff is so incredible that one of these days you'll have everything except for a hand sticking out of a television handing you money.
Yeah, it's so funny you say that. So I say this a lot around my home to the kids. But, I'm a Cold War kid. And the dynamic of the world that I grew up in, I mean, even more so different, right? But I'm being a Cold War kid before really technology. Jeremy's the same way because we're the same age. And it's crazy to me to think that things that, I've always been, I'm a big reader, and I was, boringly enough, I was a philosophy of political theory major in college.
So was I. I was journalism and political theory.
Well, and the thing I liked about it was this idea of kind of like seeing the context of humanity and how it related, not just individually, but in groups, and then towards like a cohesive structure of how people would associate with one another. And so I found that fascinating, but I also found writers really fascinating. So like, Orwell, Aldous Huxley, and the things that they wrote about were so Isaac Asimov, things like way in the future, things that were just thoughts about potentially what could happen. And then all of a sudden,
you would think that they were like, off in outer space, and the stuff they wrote about we're seeing.
or even like cloning, right? Human cloning. Like, I'm not I can't say I'm very much of a science person. I mean, I took science.
I'm kind of dumb on science,
but the fascination of it, like even pop culture stuff, like Michael Crichton and the stuff that he wrote about in the 70s and 80s. Maybe Jurassic World's real. Who knows? I mean, like, but the fact is that there's all these things that have taken place, and I do a lot of trainings. I consider myself a veteran of the industry, not like yourself, but enough of a veteran to know that there's been some major changes in the time that I've been in it. And most of them have to do with technology, which is just fascinating because I'm not a technology person. I'm not a techie. I don't have gadgets. I live kind of like a really quiet existence when I'm not at work outside of like, I don't care about phones and watches and all that other crap.
Man. People say to me, "Where's your phone?" I don't know.
Yeah, me too. I turn mine off during the day most of the time, actually. Just put it on silence. But I think it's fascinating for your perspective because when I do trainings at work, I always say it's a lot easier to know where we are because the way I like to explain it to people is let me tell you where we've come from. Right. And you kind of take them along in sort of like the progression of things. Now, I would say the last 10 years is just crazy, the progression, because,
yeah, I mean, in 10 years, we've gone a couple generations, Oh,
I agree with you. I agree with you. I mean, from the advent of the actual, payment terminal at the checkout, where a cash register, some sort of cash register software system could now interface with a terminal and take a card payment, originally swipe. Yeah, and we're not that far away from that. That wasn't that long ago. And
no. I remember when it was like a big deal that you could swipe your product across a screen and have the price register. Remember?
Yeah, totally. It's funny. It's funny. And now with the incompatibility and integration, and I find myself understanding things about technology because it's a requirement of my job to know how these things are working. So maybe I know more than I really give myself credit for, but taking it from your context and seeing where you've come from and basically being at the advent of the entire thing. I mean, you're really at the genesis.
I mean, I wrote, in fact, and back in the 80s, they used to, instead of having magazines, they had newsletters, right? I mean, they were these very high-priced newsletters that people like you would buy to find out what's the latest in regulations. I did the first newsletter on EFT. I mean, and now I look and it's like, I still keep copies of it, just for ha-ha's sake. So I could, say, gee, look how far we've come. Because in those days, we used to literally run charts of how many POS devices can take a debit card.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because I look at even in my, I've been in a couple decades and when I look at ETA and its role, it's not a trade association any longer, even though what it started out as just kind of a way for people that were in this space that were regional to associate with one another. It's now like a heavy duty lobby group. I mean, think about this. I didn't even know this. I was on a podcast last week or a couple weeks ago, and I mentioned Jared Isaacman because, one of the things that he did at Harbor Touch when he came out with the POS to find stickiness, I mean, that's only like 15 years ago. And that was one of the things he gave his agents.
What about his free terminals?
That's what I'm saying. And so I look at a guy like that who kind of understood the marketplace and how to actually gain customer loyalty in a way to at least get them signed up. Because once a merchant account comes on, it hardly ever goes away. I mean, if it's not broke, don't fix it. And then, lo and behold, I actually checked into the news this past weekend because I was sick last week. And I found out that he's been nominated to be the head of NASA. And and he's a fascinating guy. The reason that there's two things that I've always liked about Jared is that his in-house everybody's in-house counsel I generally feel is a reflection of the organization.
Sure.
His in-house counsel, Jordan Frankel, has always been a fair, decent person every time that I've interacted with him, and has actually given me substantive responses, even if they weren't what I wanted to hear, in a polite and professional way.
Right.
But he was the one that told me about Jared's other business, which makes sense for the NASA thing, which was he bought and refurbished retired military aircraft and then sold it worldwide, which I thought was fascinating. Like, I don't even know how you get into that business, right? But I knew that he had that background as being a pilot and that he had done that. And then somehow he had found his way into payments. But to have somebody fascinating like that. And then I saw that he went into space and did the spacewalk. But the NASA thing's kind of crazy.
He didn't find his way into payments. He basically invented his way into payments. I mean, he started payments off like on his mother and father's kitchen table, practically. I mean, I think it was the basement actually. But, I mean, I remember meeting Jared when he was like 20 years old and he was just, outselling terminals, outselling, well, actually, no, he had already formed the company, but he was still, it was a small company outselling merchant accounts. And, I was saying to friends when I saw that, I said, yeah, that guy that's going to be the head of NASA, I knew him when he was 21.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And the thing I've appreciated about Jared is I've met him a few times. You might not remember it, but I do. And I will tell you, he's kind of the same guy every time that I've met him, regardless of his station in life. I don't think who he is really changes. He seems like a very...
I watched his hearing. I watched him in the hearing, and it was like, wow, he's still Jared. He's still the same guy. Well, doesn't age even.
Kind of, right? He looks good for his age, for sure. So let's I kind of have a tendency to tangent out, but
yeah, same here. But let's talk about some hot.
Let's talk about, because you kind of sit in a really focal place with everything. What are kind of the things in the payment space that you've been up to these days, and where's your focus been?
Well, I've been working with James Shepard a lot. We're doing, I did a podcast with him for a long time now. I have a segment of his podcast called Today in Payments, which, we update everybody on everything that's going on in the payment space. And a big, there's some really interesting stuff going on. For example, every time you have a change in administration, there's change in regulations, right? I mean, so now, of course, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has basically been
eviscerated.
Yeah. I mean, it's, gone are the regulations for big tech payment apps, the caps on late fees. What's the other one? Buy now, pay later. Yeah.
Well, unpack that first one, because I think the first one's really important that you mentioned. It's there was some regulation that was coming out for big tech companies, and
right.
The CFPB has been a real driver when it comes to consumer protection and trying to make sure that the cardholders don't get taken advantage. We go back to the Wells Fargo scandals and whatnot. But talk about kind of what was up on the CFPB rule that related to that, and how they were going to regulate big tech, and then how it fell by the wayside.
Yeah, well, so any company that had 50 million big tech company that had 50 million consumer transactions a year. So you're talking PayPal, Venmo, which is part of PayPal, right? Google Pay, Apple Pay, Amazon, Square, and eventually X. All combined, those payment apps were handling, I think the CFPB said 13 trillion a year in consumer transactions, right? And what it wanted to do is it wanted to supervise those companies, those apps, the companies that own those apps. So supervising, as you probably know, is different from regulation. Okay, a regulator goes in and they pore over somebody's books. A supervisor makes sure that you abide by consumer protection laws. So therefore, if somebody was, let's say, I don't know, Apple or Google were making loans and they were, redlining, for example, not giving loans to certain categories of consumers. Well, then the CFPB could go in there and say, okay, slap them on the wrist, give them a fine, make them, change their habits and go on. But probably the biggest problem that they were looking at was something called debanking, where an account would be closed out and the consumer would not have any access to that money. And it would basically be sitting in a pot. And, CFPB was getting a lot of complaints about that, which is one of the reasons why I passed that law, passed that regulation. Actually, yeah, it was a regulation, or I guess you would call it a regulation.
It's
or
a rule.
supervisory.
They go through rulemaking process. I mean, they're all regulations, yeah, but I think the official title is rule.
Yeah, I think the official title is rule. Thank you. And so, number one, you have to remember that CFPB was the brainchild of Elizabeth Warren. And we all know how President Trump feels about Elizabeth Warren to begin with. Of course, when Biden, so the last time that Trump was in office, he basically castrated CFPB. They didn't do anything. They just kind of sat by the wayside. Biden comes in the office and he says, okay, everything that Elizabeth Warren wanted to do, we're going to push through. And what was interesting is that this rule about big tech payments was pushed through in December of 2014. Basically in hopes that, it was going to become effective on January 7th. And so the hope was that, the rule would slip through and nobody would notice. Well, of course they noticed, and
yeah, there was a lot of that at the end of the administration. I mean, I try to consider myself very middle of the road.
Right.
Yeah, but a politician's a politician. I don't really care what the letter is next to your name.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a lot of it that goes on. I mean, everybody wants to sit and villainize the other side, but I will tell you, not just that. I mean, there were a lot of things that happened at the Biden administration that were kind of crazy, that non-business related, where they just did things that made no sense, even geopolitically, but. So the other one that I just found interesting that you threw up was, probably the late fees has less meaning, but buy now, pay later. Unpack that one.
Buy now, pay later. That was a big one. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell everyone about that one, because I think for our audience, that's one of those things that they really try to implement as maybe a ancillary product or service, a value added service that they can push out.
I mean, it's considered a form of payment, really.
Yeah,
right?
For sure.
And so what CFPB was trying to do was say, no, this is not really a form of payment. It's a form of loan. And so it needs to be the credit, the consumer credit protection laws should apply to BNPL loans. And so that meant that, you would have to do all kinds of disclosures and statements. I mean, it was going to be a heavy duty workload for the BNPL folks, because they were going to have to send out monthly statements. They were going to have to give out disclosures beforehand. They were going to have to give out disclosures later. If you're over, if you were late on your payments, yet another set of disclosures.
Was that going to be an omission of the four payment threshold? Like they were just going to get rid of
the four payment threshold was going to be applied. Yeah.
Well, but still, if you were under 4, you wouldn't have been subject to all that.
No,
correct?
If you're under 4, you weren't going to be subject to it. It had to be 4 or more payments.
Yeah, it's been a really active place, because I saw it really find a foothold maybe about, even during the Biden administration, maybe like 3-4 years ago, it felt like it was coming. And then I've seen less of it, because it used to be an offering even that I would see for myself on my personal stuff, where I would.
Oh, you and me both.
Yeah, and I haven't seen much of it recently. It's very interesting, and maybe that's why they went into hiding. They didn't know retroactively what it was going to look like.
What it was going to do, and and a lot of people that were doing it, what they found was a lot of people that were doing it were the people that were living paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah, for sure. It was another form of, different types of goods. I would say, like different types of purchases. But maybe not. I don't know. I don't shop on Amazon, so I don't necessarily know if
I do shop on Amazon a lot, because I live out in the middle of nowhere, and they'll offer me pay in for like, I buy a bunch of dog food. Let's say, you want to pay in for your dog food? No, the dogs eat it too fast.
Yeah. So and that's an interesting part. Like I can't say I'm much of a consumer. It's one of those things where. I'm not. I mean, just look at me on any Saturday, and you'll see I'm not much of a consumer, probably. But so one of the things when we were getting together about, hey, like, what do you want to talk about? Because you're a wealth of knowledge, and you brought up real-time payment.
Real-time payments. That's something I think a lot of people, there's a lot of misunderstanding about real-time payments.
Well, I will tell you, I've never really I have the basic understanding of real-time payments, a basic understanding of the players, how it works.
Right.
But at the same time, I think that there is a lot of misunderstanding. And I think there's two things. One, tell us your impression of real-time payments, but tell us how card payments intersect with real-time payments, because I think that's maybe where people don't get the differentiation of a real-time payment and the card payment and how they kind of overlap with one another.
Okay, so a real-time payment, first of all, what you have to understand is, you have your Venmos and your Zelles, and they are advertised as real-time payments, but they're not really real-time payments. It will give you, and if I send you, Chris, $50 over Venmo, you'll get that $50 immediately, but it doesn't get taken out of my account for 2 or 3 days. It often will get taken out by the ACH, or it may be used on one of the real-time payment networks. For example, RTP, which is it's owned by about 10 or 11 of the nation's largest banks, and it's operated by the clearinghouse, which is out of New York. It used to be a check clearinghouse. And so they do clear a lot of Zelle and Venmo transactions. But real-time payments are RTP or FedNow. Okay, now, to the biggest way that these intersect, in my mind at least, the biggest way that these intersect with card payments is with merchant funding.
Yeah, so explain that, because I agree with you. When I do training sessions, for new attorneys that come in or paralegals, where I try to give them an introduction into payments, what I tell them is that merchant processing application it's credit app. And most people don't understand that this is actually a form of credit. Visa, MasterCard, Discover, these are credit networks. And ultimately what they're doing is they're distributing a credit service out into an environment. And what most people don't usually get the cue on is that the merchant gets the money within 24 to 72 hours, but the cardholder doesn't pay for a good 15 to 20 days or more.
30 days, right?
Totally. So depending on where they are in their cycle at the time of purchase. So there's a float that takes place. Somebody has to cover the risk associated with that. So So when you're talking about merchant funding, tell people what you mean about that in context of real-time payments.
So as it stands now, okay, if I hand my credit card, you're the merchant, I hand you my credit card, you actually don't get that money immediately. That money is held in a reserve. And, maybe depending on how good of a customer you are, you might get it in 2 or 3 days, you might get it in 2 or 3 weeks. But with real-time payments, you can actually, if you're a merchant in good standing with your acquirer, you could get that money within seconds of taking the card transaction.
So I think what you're talking about to me is clean, efficient, makes total sense. Right. What do you think the biggest barriers to the adoption of real-time payments? Because look, you go to the shows, I go to the shows. EMV was, a 3-year, here's what everybody's talking about in the breakout sessions. Real-time payments in the late 2000 teens, it was something that everybody was talking about, and then it kind of went away. And I feel like it's a conversation that's been out there for at least a decade. And it's been something that at times has been, hey, look at this service that we had as a way to draw for the processors and acquiring banks to draw in new payments people on the acquiring side for merchants. But what do you think the barrier is? Because we're still here. I mean, FedNow is a real thing, but
FedNow is the barrier, because as long as things can't, everything eventually gets set. Well, not everything, but for the bulk of the 10,000 banks that are out there, they get settled through the Fed. So FedNow needs to be on board with all of the banks. And it takes a decade or more to get all. I mean, I remember back in the 90s, it took the Fed a decade to get all of the banks, all of the financial institutions onto PCs to submit ACH transactions. The rest, they were carrying around these big, bulky, mag tapes and delivering them to the Fed. And I think that that's going to be a big deal right now. Is that the Fed? My last time I looked, I think the Fed had a few hundred banks on Fed now.
How does the implementation into Fed now? But how does RTP sit in, and how could they actually grab more market share to accelerate that?
Well, RTP settles amongst themselves on the books of the clearinghouse, so they can definitely, charge ahead. And I should actually correct myself slightly. You don't get the merchant doesn't get immediately get that money. It's like at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's a daily thing. Yeah, for sure. Almost like a badge, but it comes through.
Yeah, it comes through as the badge comes through much like at the end of the day instead of at the end of the week, right?
Yeah. So to you as a merchant advocate, because I think that you're probably I could phrase you that.
I like you. I play both sides.
Well, me too. But I find myself as I think when shit rolls downhill, merchants usually sit at the bottom, so I feel bad for them. So I try to be sympathetic.
I think the merchants get a raw deal, but I think sometimes the merchants kind of asked for too much.
Sometimes, but as a merchant, because I think that if there are merchants that are actually tuning in, but there are salespeople that definitely tune into this podcast, and I think that this is one of those differentiators. If you are a salesperson, but what are the benefits to the merchant if they are able to access into real-time payments?
Yeah. So if the benefit, to the merchant, if they're able, to access into real-time payments, is that they're going to have a much better cash flow. I mean, their cash flow is going to be far superior to the average merchant. But I don't think that all the merchants are going to get access to real-time payments. I think it's going to go to the cream of the crop.
Just the mega merchants?
Yeah.
Okay.
The Walmarts, the Targets, you have them. Chris, another thing that I didn't mention when we were talking before that I think everybody really ought to keep an eye out for is Durbin 2.0.
Yeah, you know what? That's a good one. Why don't you explain to people? And I think we've done this on the podcast before, but explain Durbin 1.0 and explain how it didn't work.
Yeah.
And then explain Durbin 2.0, and then give me a real opinion about what you think.
Okay. So Durbin 1.0 was the Federal Reserve was given the authority to cap debit card interchange on the largest banks. Okay. And the theory being that if the merchants were paying less interchange, that money would go to either lower prices or, it would flow down to the consumer.
And it's really been, to me, the only federal legislation that really has touched card payments. I mean, True. It is. And also that money did not flow down to consumers. Even by the Fed's own reckoning, it did a study that found maybe, I think it was 95% of merchants did not lower their prices after implementation of Durbin 1.0. So the 5% that did were, even among those, it wasn't all of the money. It was like a part of the money that flowed down. Now, Durbin 2.0, what they want to do is they want to give every merchant a choice of which network they get to choose, one of two networks over which their transactions will process, but only one of those networks can be owned by Visa or MasterCard. Well, the interesting thing to me is I've seen this from some different viewpoints. There was a situation that somebody brought to us about a year ago, and when Durbin 2.0 came out, there was at Fiserv, and I'll just say it was a Fiserv, all of a sudden, all of the transactions seem to be pushed out to Excel and Star, which are owned by Fiserv.
Right.
And then all of a sudden I had guys who had basically done the pricing to get an account on debit and priced debit super low. And then all of a sudden debit, it spiked up to like 3.25 bips or something like something crazy. Right. I mean, and there were a lot of guys that I knew that were in the petrol space that all of a sudden they were like, my merchants are freaking out. I don't really know what to do. And I think that this was a big push for Durbin 2.0 was, hey, like, let's find something that's, not network, but that would still only be, card brand related. What do you do in the situation where you've got...
think about this, Chris. This is something that just recently happened, and it's not completely through yet, but the Justice Department, said it has no problems with Cap One acquiring Discover. Okay? Discover owns an EFT network, Pulse.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
So, what's if Discover wants to become a full-fledged credit card network, Durbin 2.0, the way it's written, the choice could be Visa or Discover.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It still doesn't accomplish what it's intended to accomplish. But
no, it's never going to accomplish what because otherwise, I mean, technically it can't accomplish what it wanted just using Visa and MasterCard as the examples. Because if you use Visa and MasterCard, and what the idea is, well, they can go out and get one of those EFT networks, those ATM networks, to be the choice. But those are not. They're single rails, right? Is that how you put it? Is that the
closed loop
right terminology?
I would call that closed loop.
Closed loop, okay. And whereas Visa and MasterCard are not.
Yeah, so, I just learned that distinction because somebody told me that Amex has a debit card, and Amex came out and said in the context of surcharging, and Amex does indeed have a debit card. I just found this out.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Only around since like 2023. It's a brand new thing. But when we were talking to some people on the surcharging side in a particular industry, they were saying that at Amex, all surcharges had to be uniform, even for debit cards. And I was like, you can't surcharge debit cards. What are you talking about? That's like a direct violation of Durbin. Amex is closed loop. Durbin doesn't apply to it.
Oh, wow.
And I had never made that distinction, and I don't know. Can't remember who it was that told me this, but I was really kind of blown away. Like, first that Amex had debit cards. Like,
I'm writing that one down.
Yeah, totally. I was like, can somebody verify that? Because I've never heard of that at all. But it was verified that Amex doesn't indeed have debit cards, and that you have to surcharge the Amex debit card the same as you surcharge the Amex credit card, and it has to be compliant with whatever surcharge laws. And I was really kind of thrown. Because we were doing some, we do a lot of like regulatory compliance on certain stuff that is really gray, and there's state laws, there's no federal standard, you got card brand rules that apply to it. None of them are the same, so you're trying to figure it out, right?
Right. That's something I did not know. I knew they had, the what do you call it, prepaid cards, but their own debit card. That's interesting because. The thing that always got me is that, okay, with Visa and MasterCard, you got a rail going in, you got a rail coming out, right? With the typical EFT network, ATM network, you have a rail going in, period. Goes in, the money comes out of the machine, right?
Yep.
But if Amex is a closed loop, and if the new Cap One can become a closed loop, that would be very interesting.
It'd be interesting, huh? It's funny.
My thought with the Cap One was that they would throw a bunch of money behind Pulse and create their, sort of merge it with the Discover network.
Hey, I got one for you that just popped into my mind.
What's that?
The Illinois law that came into effect.
Wow,
you've been around for so long. And what do you think of the Illinois law? And look, I mean, everybody and their brother is going to fight it.
There's now 20 states that are debating that kind of law.
Yeah, what do you think is going to happen with that?
I I can't say the word that I want to say.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
First part of it is cluster.
Yeah. No. It's crazy, right? I mean, it's crazy that they did it, in the fact that there's. I mean, maybe that's the way that there's going to be some sort of regulation on the card brands, is it's going to come from the states.
That's what I'm saying. That's one of my thought when they first did Illinois was, okay, merchants can't get their way in the feds, so they'll take it to the states, and then the states will balk, and finally the feds will do something.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, maybe that's what this is. I hadn't really thought about it, but it happened, believe it or not, with sales tax. For the longest time, when you had digital platforms, there were, the sale of goods across state lines, and nobody really knew how do you implement sales
Remember
tax.
that? Yeah, with Amazon and everything. Yeah. Sure.
And then finally, there was a Supreme Court case that came out and said, look, I think it was like South Dakota. They were trying they were trying to assess taxes to purchases to its residents that were coming from out of state on an online platform, and the Supreme Court came out and said, hey, yeah, like if you're selling goods inside a particular jurisdiction, you're subject to its state laws. It doesn't really matter if you're not there.
This very well could go to the Supreme Court, Chris. I mean, because it's that thorny of an issue.
Yeah. It's going to take a while too.
Yeah, and it's you got 50 different states right now. You have 20 different states debating it, right? And you have Illinois is supposed to go into effect on July 1, but only for Illinois merchants.
Yeah, no, that's the other thing. This reminds me of kind of the incongruity of money transmission, and there's no federal standard, right? I mean, there's certain things. Surcharge is the same thing. All of these states are going to pass laws. None of them are going to be the same, or unless they band together and try to create some sort of like an agreement amongst states, almost like Articles of Confederation, something like that, related to business.
It's interesting because back in the 80s, back in the 70s, there was no interstate banking. Okay, so what happened is that the states started making these compacts. Like New York and the New England states and New Jersey would make a compact, and they could branch out to each other's states.
Well, it sounds like payments, right? Because all the networks were regional, right?
I'm saying it sounds to me like you could do something like that. And then once the ball started rolling, finally the feds threw up their hands and said, okay, interstate banking is A-okay, know? I think this is my thing though, Chris, and maybe I'm way off base here, but I can see them doing it with sales tax. I'm not exactly sure how they can do it with the tips.
Yeah, that's a tough one. And, unfortunately, the worker's the one that gets caught in that one.
The workers are the one. I mean, I'm one of those people that I always leave tips with cash. Because, when I was a kid, I waited tables, and, they would skim off that. They would skim off the interchange fee off of my tips.
Oh yeah, for sure. And the fact that the interchange fee is applied, I mean, it's almost like free money, beyond the base cost. Yeah, but look, I didn't mean to go too far off the beaten path on that one.
I'm glad you did, because I hadn't even thought about that when you and I kind of were discussing this beforehand.
Just being a lawyer, it's one of those things I've been fascinated with, the fact that you've got a state that's sort of spearheaded an attempt to legislate, really like a marketplace that the Fed has basically said we're going to be hands off.
Yeah.
And they're not necessarily declared monopolies, but they're kind of quasi-governmental actors, in my opinion, because they have so much power.
Right.
But, it's very interesting to see Illinois take on this fight. I'm surprised it wasn't California, to be honest with you, but
it surprised me that it was Illinois. I was expecting it to be New York or California.
Yeah, for sure.
We used to say in the old days, where the way New York and California goes is the way the rest of the country goes.
Generally speaking, yeah. I mean, it's not great always being a resident, but at the same time, you kind of see where things are happening.
Yeah, I mean, but it doesn't always happen that way anymore, as this proves.
Yeah, for sure. So, back to kind of like the our base. What do you see? Because we've asked this of some people that are longtime industry participants recently. Like, where do you see the ISO going at this point in time? I mean, there's a lot of competition from vendors, and the landscape's changing. Like, where do you see, issues potentially and opportunities?
I think the landscape has always been changing from day one, from the first time that Paul Green started the first ISO, all the way to today. Today we have a lot of ISVs that are partnering with ISOs. You're going to see a lot more of that, but I still think there's going to be a place for the ISO. I think that the ISO, like one of the things I've heard from people that have dealt with ISVs is they don't know how to sell. They don't even know how to sell their own products.
That's the thing. That's actually where I think the opportunity lies. I was just thinking about that. I've watched software companies buy payments companies now, which has been a different trend, right? And I think part of that is because the payments guys are sales guys and they know how to sell. If you can teach the payments guys the software, it could be a match made in heaven.
It could be a match made in heaven. And I think that you're going to see a lot more of those combination of ISVs and ISOs. Those are going to be the ISOs that are going to really soar. But I think you're still going to see the ISOs that are trying, they're going to plod along because everything changes so much. I mean, I can't even imagine what the next technology innovation is going to be. But you and I both know that something's going to come along. And, it's going to give the ISO new life, just like POS terminals gave them new life.
I'll tell you what, like I came in what I call the smash and grab era with leasing terminals.
Yeah.
And leasing got a really bad name. Northern got pushed out. People stopped leasing because it was just such a deterrent. Nobody wanted to hear any of that.
Right.
And today, with the expense of a one-time expense related to wireless terminals into POS systems that are integrated through a Wi-Fi in somebody's business, like a restaurant, that's a pretty big price tag. So leasing actually or financing of some sort of makes sense.
Yeah.
Because we're not talking about a $200 terminal anymore. We're talking about systems that could be $25,000 to $100,000.
$10,000 to $100,000. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
And leasing becomes a more, so that's what I'm thinking. I mean, I think that sort of what goes around comes around. In that respect,
I think that'd be great. Where do you see kind of some of the deterrents or like the barriers for the ISO these days as far as adaptation?
I think the barrier is going to be the old guys that just can't make change. I think that we have a lot of fresh. I haven't been to the ETA in a few years. I go to the regional ones, and I see a lot of young, fresh faces. Fresh out of college. And they're out to build their portfolios. And I think that, if they team up with the right older guys, they're going to go places. And if the older guys can't keep up with those younger guys, they're just going to retire. They're going to take their residuals and retire.
All right. And well,
they have some good residuals. I mean, let's face it. I mean,
no. Residual income's a great thing. And look, I go to all the regional shows too, and I do. I'm always surprised when I see kind of like I wouldn't say it's en masse, but I do see an integration of new people coming in. And I'm always amazed when I do talk to people. I mean, I get a lot of people that come up and, ask questions, and I'm always happy to talk to people, no problem. And I'm always interested to see how many people operate in a way or a space that I didn't even think that was very prevalent any longer. But they're still doing it, and they're not really big, but they're super successful, and they're making a pretty damn good living.
And the other thing that really surprises me are like, I was just at the NEAA. Okay.
Me too.
Okay. Did you go to the where they did the new the competition?
No, I was exhibiting, so I kind of got stuck at the table.
Okay. Oh, that's right. That's right. I saw you exhibiting. Yeah. Okay, so they had some interesting stuff in the competition, like automated AI. They were all AI powered innovations. Okay, one of them that could take your order on the phone and get it perfectly and sound perfectly like a person.
Yeah, that's great. Like it's sort of that's the other thing I saw. I go to this place with my daughter sometimes where. It's a hot pot place that they have in one of the local malls, and they got robots that kick out all the food around.
Oh, that's funny.
And which I always thought was pretty cool too. It's like it's one of those innovations within. It wasn't necessarily a replacement for the waiters and waitresses as much as a supplement.
Yeah, as an innovation. Yeah. And another one of those innovations that I saw was it was a guy that had somehow managed to get like all the SKUs imaginable into a system for mom and pop shops. In fact, it's called Bodeg AI.
Yeah, that's pretty cool too. I've seen some stuff related to digital pricing off the SKU system too.
Yeah.
Where you can get the SKUs into the computer and
Yep.
then they'll transmit to wherever you place the product.
Yes.
And you can change the prices to stay compliant with surcharging so you can have list price, cash price.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's pretty fascinating. I can't proclaim to know that like conceptually I get it, but technically I don't think I understand.
Same here. I'm not a science person, but I mean, when I watched this guy do the demonstration, I was in awe. And in fact, I think I wrote it in one of the green sheet columns I did. And that is where I think that's going to be another way that the ISO is going to be able to march forward if they can figure out ways to capture AI.
All right. Well, look, I really appreciate you coming on the show. It's always good to have you here.
I love it.
I love your knowledge. Is there anything you want to? I'm going to give you the last word. Is there anything you want to tell us on the way out?
Nothing I can think of, but just keep on trucking, man, because this business, I tell people say to me, why do you write about payments? Why are you somebody? Because it's the engine that keeps the economy going. And
you and I are the same.
changing.
I can't say I really identify with my profession. Like a lot of people, they identify with what they do, and it's kind of like part of their person.
Right.
I don't really identify with myself as an attorney, but I will say the thing that keeps me coming back is payments because it changes every day and it makes things interesting.
Every day, and if it wasn't making it interesting, I would have left a long time ago. Look at how much gray. Look at my hair isn't gray; it's white.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Patty. We really appreciate it.
Yeah,
I love talking with you, Chris. We'll do it again sometime, okay?
Okay, sounds good. You take care of yourself.
Soon, guys. This was really a great conversation and a lot of context for, like you were saying, where payments has been and where it's at now and maybe where it's headed. Thank you for listening to the Payments Experts Podcast, a podcast of Global Legal Law Firm. Today we had joining us Patti Murphy. Patti, thank you so much. It was great. And as always, Christopher Dryden in studio. Have a good one. We'll see you on the next one.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Patty.
Peace and love.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Payments Experts Podcast, a podcast of Global Legal Law Firm. Visit us online today at globallegallawfirm.com.